And welcome back to another episode of the Cool Your Jets podcast. We're your hosts, Ben Blessington and Michael Nania. Michael, Jets fans can take a sigh of relief. Finally, Zach Wilson and the Jets have come to an agreement on his rookie contract. Michael, your initial thoughts?
It's just a relief. As soon as you saw that tweet from Rappaport, it's like just a big sigh of relief, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. This distraction is just a thing of the past. We're gonna forget it ever happened as soon as tomorrow. And it felt like a long time already, but ultimately it's only going to amount to 2 practices missed. So it wasn't
on
a
field.
huge deal on 2 on-field practices. So ultimately we'll forget about it and it won't be a big deal. It was a petty thing that shouldn't have happened, but it's not something that's going to matter. It's time to go now.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, this podcast is sponsored by Canadips CBD. I think it was bad from a PR perspective, more so than anything. But you have to remember the first few days of training camp, they're just redoing the install that they did in mini camp. So Wilson's already gotten that, and he's been in contact with Michael LaFleur and Robert Saleh. And it was obviously a question of when, not if. There was really not much doubt in my mind that he was going to get signed before Saturday's practice. I can't imagine that the Jets would roll him out there in front of or roll the team out there in front of the fans with no Zach Wilson. It's a bit strange that they would wait this long to do it. The report that came out that Zach Wilson even put on a story, which kind of adds some validity to it, is that the Jets didn't even open negotiations until this week. And they wanted to defer $6 million of his signing bonus until 2022. Wilson says no, like the other quarterbacks, like he did with Darnold. I want all that signing bonus now. And the Jets also wanted to put in some offset language. And the compromise is basically the Jets get the offset language. Wilson gets a signing bonus, which seems like that should have been the compromise from the beginning. I'm not going to pretend to know the exact inner workings of the Jets, salary structure and exactly what was going on behind the scenes. It seems ridiculous, though, that it's like you have 3 months to get this done. It's not the big deal. It's not the biggest deal. At the end of the day, he missed 2 on-field practices. He was still in meetings today. We're all going to forget in a week that he even missed anything. I honestly forgot that Darnold held out until this whole story resurfaced. So, and Darnold held out, I think, until Saturday's practice. So Darnold missed 3 practices. So not the end of the world. Glad it's done. And from a PR perspective, it sucks. And it was probably a bit of a distraction. But finally, we get to see some training camp Zach Wilson tweets, which, Michael, I don't know about you, but I've been waiting for these since he got drafted. I mean, the mini camp tweets held me over for the last 6 weeks, but the training camp tweets, when I get the real passing numbers, that's where the good stuff comes out. A few other notes, because we've had to watch or read tweets about James Morgan and Mike White the last few days, it's very clear that the Jets' backup quarterback situation is in bad shape at the moment. And look, I mean, James Morgan at this point is basically a rookie. Didn't get any real offseason activities last year, had no preseason. So it's a new scheme. So the lumps are expected. Mike White had a little bit of a better day, but it's very clear that the Jets are going to have to add a veteran quarterback. They brought in Josh Johnson and Sean Mannion for a workout. Part of it was maybe didn't know how long the Zach Wilson dilemma was going to go on. You need, you don't want to burn out Morgan and White's arms, but at the same time, I think they probably knew that the Wilson deal was going to get done. So I think Johnson and Mannion are legit competition that are going to come in and compete for that backup spot. Michael, what numbers, if any, do you have on these two guys? Obviously, I'm a little bit partial to Sean Mannion, the Oregon State Beeve, but also Josh Johnson's had some success and some success in Florham Park in a green and white uniform a few years ago, having a good preseason. So do you like those guys, and do you think it's a significant upgrade over James Morgan and Mike White?
Well, one thing that stood out with both of them is that they both do have a little bit of a connection to Mike LaFleur and this offense. Josh Johnson was with the Niners last season, had a cup of tea with them, and Sean Mannion played with the Rams for the past. He's with the Vikings past couple years, but played with Sean McVay for a few years. Obviously, McVay comes from the same coaching tree, the Shanahan coaching tree, as Mike LaFleur does. So they both have that experience in the offense, which is obviously important if you're going to add a player in the later stages of the offseason. But in terms of production, I think we have to be completely honest. Both of these guys have been really bad. I kind of expected to see better numbers from them before digging into it, but there isn't much to like. Johnson has 8 touchdowns and 14 picks in his career, 61.7 passer rating. He's 1-7 as a starter. Mannion is 0-3 as a starter. He has 0 touchdowns and 3 picks in his career. So you're not getting much in terms
Right.
of production out of these guys, but at least they have experience in offense. But I think the hope is that James Morgan or Mike White being younger guys, although White isn't too young, he's 26, but he hasn't played in the regular season yet. Um, I think you're hoping that one of these guys can develop into something better as a backup than one of those two guys or one of the backups that you could pick up off the street. But there are bigger name backups you could look at. Nick Foles could become available. Blake Bortles is out there. So there are better options in terms of backups. But ideally, I think you'd like to see one of the younger guys take a leap and just at least be, competent. Because those numbers that I just brought up, that's pretty bad. Even though they're veterans, and they've experienced that's not good performance. You're not going
Yeah.
to win games with those two guys. So hopefully one of them, White or Morgan, can develop. But to get one of those two in there, just to add competition, a little bit more experience to the mix, it wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, certainly scraping the bottom of the barrel to find any sort of veteran quarterback. But I think the reason that they brought those two in particularly over a guy like Blake Bortles, like you said, is because they both have some experience in this type of offense. It's not going to be um, as much of a learning curve. I think ultimately, unless Josh Johnson has a great I think out of the two, I think Johnson's the one that'll get signed. I like his as much as I like Sean Mannion for being a Beeve. I think Johnson's the better player. And he had a good little stint here in preseason. Obviously, those stats don't get included. Um, but I still don't think either of them make the final roster. I think maybe they survive the initial 53 cut, but I still think that once a guy like Brian Hoyer shakes free, or maybe Nick Foles shakes free, like you said, once the better veteran options shake free, I think that might be when they can bring him in. I mean, it really does come down to how much they value the experience in this game, which I know it makes sense right now, but if a guy like Nick Foles gets cut, 2 weeks before the season starts, I think that's when or a week before the season starts, I think, you spring him in and then you hope Wilson doesn't get hurt for the first month of the season or whatnot, let him learn the playbook. But I don't mind it. I think they do end up bringing one of those guys in. It's a bummer about Morgan, but again, you have to remember, it's like, look, guys had no experience. He was supposed to be a project. We'll learn a lot more about him in the preseason games. And I guess you're just looking to see improvement throughout training camp. We were hoping that he could be ready to be a quarterback too, but those expectations really aren't fair considering he didn't get any he's seen literally no action. So a QB3 role makes more sense for him, but it seems like Mike White is having the better camp of the two throughout 2 days in padless practices. So we'll see how that storyline develops. The other one piece of news that came out yesterday was that the Jets were working out Jordan Matthews, the former receiver for the Eagles and the Bills, converted to tight end. The Jets bring him in for a workout. Obviously, the Jets tight end spot is pretty barren. We're going to talk about the position a little bit later in this podcast. Michael, what do you think about the potential addition of Jordan Matthews? Does that move the needle for you? Or do you think he's just a camp body?
I actually do think this is kind of interesting. And ultimately, of course, I don't think he will make the team just because the odds of something like that panning out are not great. But I'm interested to see what he does with this switch because, the game he played at wide receiver as a physical, big red zone threat kind of lends itself well to making this transition to tight end. He's put on 30 pounds. He was up to, there was a video in mid-July where he was at 236. He weighed in. So he's got his weight up, and it seems like he's fully committed to it. He was at the tight end university camp that George Kittle hosted. He tried out for teams as a tight end. His agent is known for working with some of the biggest tight ends in the league. So it seems like he's bought into it. He kind of has some familiarity with Mike LaFleur. He was with the Niners the past couple of years on their practice squad last season, although he didn't play much with them in the regular season, only 3 games, and he didn't get targeted. But he was there, so he does have a little bit of familiarity. And obviously, this is if you're a tight end trying to make a team, this is one of the best teams in the league to try out for, with not a ton of depth at this position. So it's definitely a good opportunity for him. But I'm intrigued to see what he does because he was a great red zone threat with the Eagles. He actually had the 8th most red zone touchdowns among wide receivers in the league over his first 2 seasons. Then he kind of tapered off after that and bounced around the league. But I'm interested to see what he does. This is a flyer that I definitely think is worth taking a look at. So ultimately, of course, I'm not going to predict him to make the team. That would be a very hot take. But I'm interested to see if he can at least get signed to the roster, get himself involved, and get the chance to make some plays in the preseason.
I don't know if it's a crazy hot take, Michael. I mean, I think we have to see him at that tight end spot with the added weight. How does he look as a blocker first and foremost?
Right.
But you know, he he's an okay receiver, but an okay receiver you put him at tight end might be a good receiving tight end. So we'll see what the Jets can do with him. You have to keep in mind the Niners kept a ton of tight ends last year, and I think the Jets are lacking depth there. I think if the Jets do go deeper at tight end, it would be a battle between him and Kenny Yeboah for that receiving tight end, not necessarily a blocker. From a youth perspective, you'd hope that Yeboah would win that battle. But like you said, hey, Matthews went to tight end university. Maybe he's picked up some stuff. My only big memory of Jordan Matthews, and Mike, I don't know if you remember this, was 2017 week 1, where Kevin Harlan just kept mixing up Jermaine Kearse and Jordan Matthews' names because they'd just both been recently added.
I do remember that.
So it was like Jermaine Kearse had a big gain. He was like, "That's Jordan Matthews," and he's like, "Kearse." So that's the only real memory I have of Jordan Matthews. But a veteran receiver, if he's a camp body, I like it, and we'll see if he can make any noise. The big question,
it's funny you bring that up because I just want to make a quick Kevin Harlan point. He has some classic moments, a lot of classic moments, and he's great overall. But he is a little bit susceptible to mixing up names occasionally.
It was
it's
week
the one
1.
Weakness in his game.
It was week 1. He was,
but I do
rusty.
think even in addition to that, it's kind of been a little bit of a recurring issue for him. But he's still a superstar, I think.
Flame Kevin Harlan like that. Okay, Mike.
I'm not flaming. It's just a little point to me.
At some point, I think we've done this before in the podcast. We might have to redo our top 5 announcer rankings because I think Kevin Harlan has worked his way onto my list for sure.
I think he's up there. Everyone has a little hole in their game. And speaking of hole in their game, Jordan Matthews and the run blocking is, I think, a good point you bring up because as a receiver, he really wasn't great as a blocker. Even as a bigger receiver at 6'3", 215, he consistently graded as a pretty average, sometimes below average run blocker. So blocking at tight end, even though he's bulked up now, is a question mark. And especially in this offense, it's going to be a huge part of this position for these tight ends to be able to block in the run game. So that's the biggest question mark for him. But as a receiver, I'm definitely intrigued to see what he does. So this is one that I'll be keeping an eye on.
It's a bit relevant to this point, just about when you look at San Francisco, how many tight ends they carried, and they really valued that versatile tight end fullback, being able to show a big run heavy formation and then run deep play action off of it. We talked about it in our Zach Wilson podcast, kind of like, what do you think this Jets offense will look like with him? That's the number one thing I'm fascinated about. I mean, we're not going to get a great look at it in preseason because it's generally pretty vanilla offenses, basic concepts. But I'm just so fascinated about how Mike LaFleur plans to run this offense because, like you said last week, it's like the strength of this offense personnel-wise is not the strength of a typical West Coast, or at least a typical Shanahan offense. I mean, they have a good offensive line. I guess they have a solid group of running backs. The quarterback position seems pretty great for a West Coast offense. But between the tight end, the fullback, not much talent there, which is really want a lot of strength and versatility. And then there's a ton of talent at receiver, which was maybe not as important in this offense. So I'm fascinated to see what Mike LaFleur's version is going to look like compared to Kyle Shanahan, compared to Sean McVay, compared to his brother, compared to Arthur Smith, compared to all those other wide zone West Coast offenses. What does Mike LaFleur's look like with this personnel? Jordan Matthews, I think, like you said, probably won't make the roster, but I wouldn't count against it. If he makes some noise with Mike White or Josh Johnson throwing him the ball in preseason, you can maybe see him move up the depth chart, provide some depth, be a little fun receiving H-back option, give the Jets some versatility at that tight end spot. The other piece of news, and this hasn't really come to effect throughout the first 2 practices since George Fant tested positive for COVID, but Robert Saleh acknowledged that the right tackle spot is going to be an open competition between Moses and Fant, which I think was interesting because a lot of people assume more. I mean, look, coaches always like to preach competition, but it seemed like Moses was going to be handed that right tackle spot. The pads haven't come on yet, so it's hard to get a good feel of how he's necessarily performing. There's a big run to the right side yesterday, so take that with a grain of salt. But if there's a true right tackle competition, Michael, you talked about how, in theory, George Fant fits the scheme better, but also Morgan Moses is probably the better player. We've talked about this a lot, but how do you think they balance that, especially if it is going to be a true training camp competition.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch this play out. And I think even though most of us assumed Moses was coming in to start right tackle, which I definitely did, his contract number wasn't that big or isn't that big. He only got $3.6 million base salary, which is right in the neighborhood of some of the other mid-tier linemen on the team, Alex Lewis, Van Roten, even Dan Feeney. So he didn't get guaranteed starter money. So that possibility was always there, and that's a fraction of what Fan is making this year. So it'll be fun to watch because it's an interesting dilemma where you have Fan, a guy who projects really well in this scheme, and then you have Moses, a guy who's more established, more durable, experienced, and probably the better player overall, but isn't as perfect of a scheme fit. I don't think he's a bad scheme fit. He definitely is a better athlete than I think his numbers, his combine numbers let on, but he's not as much of a shoe-in of a fit as I think George Fant is. And a big reason I think Fant is a great fit is in addition to the obvious advantage of his athleticism. And I believe we talked about this before, or I've mentioned it before,
Yeah,
is
O-line
that
preview.
yeah, that he's a really good backside blocker. And I think that's what he did the best. And if you assume the Jets are going to be running very heavily to the left side behind Becton and Elijah Vera Tucker, then that allows George Fant's blocking on the backside to shine. He does a really good job of when the defender's lined up over his inside shoulder, he does a great job of getting his hips around him, sealing that guy to the backside so he can't pursue the run from behind and make a play. So that complements really well the strength that you have on that left side of the line. So in addition to just, him flat out being a good athlete, I think that skill plays well with what they have, the talent they have on the left side of the line. So I like Fan this offense quite a bit, but Morgan Moses is a solid right tackle, and George Fan, as much as I like him, hasn't necessarily proven to be at that level yet. So it'll be an interesting competition, but no matter who wins, I think the Jets can feel good knowing they're going to have one of the best backup tackles in the league. So that's the biggest thing about the Moses signing. We'll see how this competition plays out, but either way, your backup is going to be Moses or Fant instead of Chuma Edoga or Connor McDermott, and
Right.
that's where the upgrade is coming in.
Definitely. And I think that when Fant does get into camp, I'll be curious to see if they do maybe not employ it as the starting lineup, but do try to give Moses or Fant some reps at guard just to see the different lineups, what they could look like. Just because I think the goal is to get your best five out there. And there's a good chance that there is a chance that Fant or Moses, even if they lose the competition, is still a better right guard than Greg Van Roten or Alex Lewis or whoever plays there. So curious to see once they get in to camp, once Fant gets into camp and is healthy, how do they rotate the snaps between the two right tackles? Do they give one a day with the starters, the other day with the starters? Do they try them out at different? Do they give them reps at guard? Just kind of curious to see how that whole situation plays out. Or like you said, just have the competition. Whoever loses, you're gonna have a great swing tackle. You can do a lot of different stuff. Use that 6 offensive linemen, maybe more than other teams do, because your tight ends aren't as strong. Instead of going 12 personnel, you go 6 offensive linemen. Let's go over some studs and duds over the first 2 days. We're recording this Thursday night. Generally speaking, our podcast should come out Monday and Thursday. Last night, Michael and I were talking. We're just like, all right, I think Zach Wilson's going to sign tomorrow, so we don't want this podcast to be completely out of date. So that's why this one's coming out on Friday. But we've had 2 days of practice to kind of talk about Michael. And you'll be going to training camp practice next week, so you have a little bit more of an in-person insight and see what you see. But studs and duds from the first 2 days of training camp practice. I guess we'll start with a stud. It seems like Michael Carter has had a pretty good opening to training camp and has a firm grasp on at least maintaining a heavy workload in that running back room. Obviously, no running back is going to be a bell cow. There's certainly going to be a running back by committee approach, but a lot of beat reporters have raved about Carter's shiftiness, his fit in this offense. He's had a few nice runs. And look, if the Jets are getting starting production out of their first 4 picks, I mean, that's almost unheard of. So really nice job. Obviously, we love the strategy with the draft, but if it's hitting the field and looking good, Michael Carter, would love that pick, Michael. How do you just feel about his fit in this offense? And maybe if, could the Jets go a little bit away from the whole running back by committee approach if they do find a guy who's really having a lot of success with the unit? We didn't see that too much with San Francisco, but Michael Carter is just a guy who really, really fit this unit. And you can see in that Jets Flight 2021 documentary, that this front office was in love with Michael Carter and could not believe he was there.
Yeah, I think he definitely is a really good fit in this offense because we saw a lot of examples of him making plays in wide zone calls at North Carolina. So we've seen him make big plays in run calls that are similar to what the Jets will be running. And from a numbers perspective, there's one little niche that I really like is that Carter's best gap running the ball last year was to the outside shoulder of the left guard. And you just brought in Elijah Vera Tucker. He
Love that.
led USC to some great production to his outside shoulder, and he's playing left guard in 2019. So you combine those two guys together, and it's
And
exciting to
Becton.
think about. And Becton over there too. So it's exciting to think about that. And I'm sure that's something that they noticed that Michael Carter is having all this success running to the left guard. Now let's put him behind our first round pick. It's a really intriguing matchup. And like you said, I could see, obviously I think the basis of this offense is going to be that committee approach to start out. But if Carter gets to that point where he's just the clear number one guy, he has that 3-down potential, I think, because he is a good
Definitely.
pass blocker. He's not Derrick Henry. He's not going to run people over. He's a pretty small guy. He's really small. He's only
Who does
5'8".
he remind you of if you had to compare him?
But it's tough to think because I just mentioned the size. Like he's really small. I don't know if I could think of a guy who's that. If you think of one, let me know because it's probably just skipping my mind. But a guy who's that small, who's an every down back.
Yeah.
But I think he can be an every down back because even though his power isn't necessarily amazing, he definitely has some of it in his game, and his ability to be a pass catcher and a good pass blocker allows him to stay on the field in any situation. So I think he can eventually develop into that every down guy. But I'm actually going to do some research here. I'm going to
All
find
right.
some short running backs
Well, I was going to
that
say the
have been
shortest running back that
successful.
comes to mind. Obviously there's a few, because that's one of those positions you can really benefit from being lower to the ground. It's harder for defenders to see. You have good leverage. I mean, Doug Martin is a guy who had some success early in his career,
Yeah,
muscle
yeah,
hamster.
muscle
Uh,
hamster.
Ray Rice, before the off-field incidents, was having success. It's a smaller running back. If you want a little bit more shiftier, but not an all every down running back. I mean, obviously there's a guy like Tariq Cohen in recent years. So, but as far as the every down guys, I mean, Martin and Rice, the first two that come to mind. Obviously, there's, Barry Sanders is a small back. Obviously, we're not comparing Michael Carter to Barry Sanders, but it's certainly doable. I think because of this, well, we'll see him on the field. I was going to say because of the size, there are going to be questions about if he can be an every down back, but clearly he can be a big part of this rotation. And like you said, I'm excited to see him on third downs and how that pass blocking transitions or translates from college to the pros, because that's always a big thing where it's like running backs who protect well in college. Like Michael Pirine had this reputation. He did all right last year protecting the quarterback, but there's a lot of running backs who come out with this reputation of being good pass protectors, and they get to the NFL and they just don't look like they know what they're doing at all. I'm curious to see how Michael Carter stands in that regard, and which running back by the end of camp will be that leaned on as that third down pass blocking running back. Because I think Coleman is going to be the third down receiving option. You can flex him out to the slot. You can do a lot of fun things with him. But who's going to be the guy that, if it is a 3rd and 12 or whatever, and you need a first down and you want to have a running back out there for whatever reason, who's the guy that you're trusting can pick up that linebacker? Because if Carter can bring that type of value, I think you're right. I don't think the height holds him back or the size holds him back. He can definitely be an every down back. Michael, you have any comparisons in mind?
So I brought up some of the short running backs who have been successful over the past decade because, again, Carter's 5'8". And there are some good ones on here. Maurice Jones-Drew at 5'7"
Forgot about
was
him.
really successful. And a guy who did contribute in the passing game a lot, like Carter can do. So he's a good one. You mentioned Ray Rice. A couple of current ones, Aaron Jones and Philip Lindsay. Aaron Jones 5'9", Philip Lindsay 5'8". I don't think Lindsay's a great comparison, though, because Lindsay is probably the worst passing game running back in the league.
Right.
He's a terrible pass blocker and drops a lot of passes.
Look at Jones in this offense, though.
But Jones, on the other hand, is definitely a guy who can, is even at his size, is able to really pound the rock, score a lot of touchdowns at the goal line, and does provide some passing game value. So Aaron Jones, maybe that's one to keep an eye on.
That's a good
Yeah.
That's a great ceiling pick. And the other thing is that they both I'm actually surprised Aaron Jones is that small because he plays big, and Michael Carter, when you watch him in college, plays the same. He doesn't look like he's 5'8", unless you see him
He's
in that.
big for 5'8". He's
Yeah.
201, which is
Well, and he's got
a
like
lot.
big athletic legs and a big frame, and like he's a strong 5'8", but he plays like that, and I think that's the same thing with Aaron Jones. So that's a really nice ceiling comparison for the Jets. Obviously, as a rookie, you can't expect that. But moving on to the duds, and look, these are 2 days of padless training camp practices. We'll see how these guys develop. But somebody who's kind of continued the downward trend, I guess, from mini camp, or at least has lost a bit of hype, especially the hype that he had going into the offseason, which was Denzel Mims, who was definitely more of a fit in Adam Gase's offense, more of a linear deep threat, can win the jump balls. And this offense is clearly his run blocking, or not his run blocking, excuse me, his route running is going to need to improve in the intermediate and short aspects of the game. But clearly he has the athleticism to do so. But the reason he's on the duds list is he's had a few drops, and it seems like he's certainly going to be running with the twos for the foreseeable future. But all the potential in the world, a second-year player. He can certainly develop into a player that, even if doesn't become a perfect scheme fit, that Michael Floor is going to have to design plays for, because he certainly has tangible skills. You saw it last year that he's not a bum. Denzel Mims is not a bum. Can he be an every down starting receiver, hopefully a number one receiver? That remains to be seen, but he certainly is, at this point in his career, at the very least, great depth, great jump ball guy. You can put him on deep routes, you can put him in the red zone. But is he going to be a perfect fit in this offense remains to be seen. But he's got to work on the drops, because that isn't something that we saw too much last year. Michael, what are your thoughts on Denzel Mims and his 2-day training camp struggle?
Well, I love the moniker that he's not a bum, because for a Jets post first round wide receiver pick, that's definitely a big accomplishment. They drafted plenty of
Yeah, he's already better than
legitimate
Stephen Hill.
bums. He's better than Chad Hansen. He's better than Ardarius Stewart. So thumbs up to that. But I actually think I did an article on it recently. I think he's a better fit in this offense than a lot of people give him credit for, because we think first, when you mention Mims, the first thing you think of is the jump balls and the red zone. Obviously, not necessarily with the Jets in the red zone, more so what he did in college. But you think of his size and the jump ball ability and the verticality. But really, where he made his best impact last year was with his yards after the catch on short and intermediate throws, whether it was just little drag routes or slants or digs. That's where he was really the most productive. And it's why he was one of the most efficient receivers in the league on short passes, less than 10 yards downfield, because he's making a lot of those grabs over the middle and making plays after the catch, just being able to halt his momentum, make guys miss, keep going. And that's where you really saw his speed, more so than vertically on go routes, is when he was catching the ball in stride that you saw his speed stand out. So I
Definitely.
think he's a better fit than given credit for. LaFleur is definitely, and of course he knows more than I do, than any of us do. If he says Mims needs to improve his route running, if he wants to go on a recorded team program that's going to go out in public and say that he needs to improve his route running, then of course he does. And I agree with that. But at the same time, I feel like on scheme touches over the middle, he's a really good playmaker. He showed that last season. But if he's going to become that true star, then like LaFleur pointed out, definitely he's got to be able to win some more of those routes over the middle. Can you
Right.
get yourself open in situations where you're not just going to be naturally opened up by the scheme? That's going to be what determines how high his ceiling goes. But I think he's already shown you that he can be, if you get the ball in his hands over the middle, or if you can give him a chance in jump ball situations, then his physical talent can really show up.
Yeah. And the other thing that helps him out is because if he can establish himself as a deep threat, those underneath routes do open up for you. You don't have to be you don't have to be Antonio Brown, or hell, Elijah Moore. We'll use him for an example. And your underneath route running, if you can establish yourself as a legitimate deep threat, the cornerback's going to bail on you. They're going to bite on your double moves. So I agree with you. I think that I felt bad about putting Denzel Mims in the duds list. It was really just the name of the segment. I don't think he deserves it. I think that heading into the offseason, he had a lot of hype. That's clearly come down a little bit with all the additions at receiver and some of the hype that the other guys have been getting, and the fact that he's running with the twos. But make no mistake about it, Denzel Mims' career has not been written yet. I really do believe in him. I think his ceiling is incredibly high. He was drafted as a guy who might be a little bit raw in the route running aspect, but he has a full offseason. Working with Miles Austin, he has some good vets in that room as well. I think you're going to see him as a guy who develops throughout the season and does make an impact. by the end of the season. I do think Denzel Mims does become a big contributor. I think maybe he isn't the week 1, number 2 receiver that we thought he might be, but I think by the end of the season, he's going to be a guy who's definitely contributing because he's just too talented not to. And like you said, he's a better scheme fit than given credit for. And the beauty of this offense supposedly is that you're going to blend. It has obviously all the same West Coast wide zone concepts, but you're going to blend it around the personnel you have. And if you have a player like Denzel Mims that's that talented, not to use an Adam Gase phrase, but that big of a unicorn. I mean, Michael Flores compared him to Kevin Durant, the way he's able to jump and utilize his wingspan. You have to find and create plays around players like that. Another guy who had a guy who had a great practice yesterday, Carl Lawson. And it's always funny. It's like this every time in training camp. That's why it's always nice to see him go up against somebody else in practice or in preseason. It's like there's always a pro and a con. And the pro is that Carl Lawson was beating everybody like a drum today or yesterday, and had multiple sacks and looked great. And that's like, all right, the Jets might, after 2 practices, might actually have an okay edge rusher, hopefully a very legitimate edge rusher. Con to that is like, all right, well, was he beating Mekhi Becton there for a few plays? That's a bit of a con, but I think the solace is that you already know Mekhi Becton can be a good player in this league, and I guess you're going to hope to see maybe Becton have a dominant day today or tomorrow, whatever it is, and maybe Carl Lawson's a little bit stifled, and just have it. You want to have that back and forth because as much as I think the Elijah Moore minicamp hype was warranted, and I think he is going to be a good player. In the back of my head, I'm wondering, I was like, well, how much of that is because our corners are really bad? So it's like there's always that battle in training camp about how good is a player doing versus how bad is it who he's going up against. You don't really get a better feel of that until preseason. But for now, Jets fans, you can take some happiness in the fact that, we actually have an edge rusher who's getting sacks, and not just, a sack a game every few games. He's getting multiple sacks in a practice. We'll see if that translates to the field. Michael, your thoughts on Carl Lawson?
Yeah, like you said, there's always it's a two-way street with anything that happens in in these training camp practices. If someone does something good, then conversely, someone on the other side probably did something bad. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like if there's really good coverage and someone makes a contested throw, or if you have a great pass against great coverage. But there are a lot of these instances where it's like this one guy did something great, so that means someone else, he had to beat someone else to do it. So I don't recall seeing many reports about Becton playing poorly, but Lawson does generally line up on the right side of the defensive line and go up against the left tackle. So you would assume he was doing it against Becton, unless he was getting those sacks against the second team. And it was Edoga or McDermott or someone else. They have a few undrafted tackles who could be playing there. But it's great to see Lawson dominating. We definitely have not had an edge rusher with the dominant potential that he has, or even close to it, in recent years. So definitely positive to see him in the early goings living up to the potential of the contract that he signed. And also, if it is against Becton, as much as we want to see Becton play well, it also is a nice indicator for Lawson because Becton is good competition. So it goes both ways. We'd like to see Becton play well against Lawson, but it's a good test for Lawson too. But it's definitely good to see him dominating early on. Anytime a defensive player stands out in practice, I think it's more impressive than an offensive player because practices are when you're not playing in pads, especially, practices are conducive to offensive success, I feel like. So if you're standing out as a defensive player in some way, I feel like that is it's more impressive than if an offensive player does.
I think it's a good point. And I'm not just trying to sound hyperbolic based off of practice, but I definitely would buy stock in Carl Lawson. I just think he's such a perfect scheme fit. I think you definitely saw it with the amount of pressures he got last year. He's worked a lot on his finishing. We'll see how it translates to the field, but I definitely think he's in store for a big year. Another guy who's maybe had an underwhelming start to the first 2 days of training camp, and maybe not necessarily from his on-field perspective, just performance, just more so his status. And that's Chris Herndon, who I think many Jets fans were hoping, and he still could earn that starting tight end spot. But clearly, based off minicamp, Tyler Kroft is going to be the tight end number 1 for at least the beginning of training camp. We'll see how injuries affect things, or if Herndon can start to make an impact and work his way back up to tight end number 1. Michael, your thoughts on Chris Herndon? I mean, best case scenario is that both Herndon and Kroft play really well, and the Jets actually can play some 12 personnel. But Herndon's just a guy who was so talented in 2018, and 2019, his whole season basically got taken away, and 2020 just seemed like a psychological issue for him. He certainly got better towards the end of the season. And this is supposed to be the year where it's like, who is Chris Herndon? I mean, he went to tight end university, like you said, over the offseason. This is a very tight end friendly offense. I'm sure LaFleur is starving for any sort of tight end production. So if he can be anything, this is the year to see it for him. I mean, what are your thoughts on Herndon and Croft taking over for that starting tight end spot?
I think Croft definitely has the edge because I feel like that they are going to lean heavily on the wide receivers in terms of where they're going to be throwing the ball. So with the tight end position kind of de-emphasized in the passing game, I feel like they're going to value run blocking more, and that's where Croft definitely has the edge over this tight end group by a pretty wide margin. But Chris Herndon, I think, will still be in the mix because Chris Herndon has the edge by a wide margin in terms of receiving ability and upside in that area. So I feel like the snaps will be pretty mixed. We've had a few conversations trying to predict starts on this podcast for the tight end position, and we always go like 8-8, 8-9, 10-7 in terms of how the starts will be split between those two guys. So I feel like the snaps will be pretty close with them too. I'm not sure how much they're going to play together because I do think this will be an 11 personnel heavy offense, and they won't do a ton of two tight ends. So I think it'll be a pretty good rotation between those two guys based on down distance and situation, with Herndon being your more passing game centric player because he's a good pass blocker, obviously your best receiver at the position, and Croft being the more run game centric player. And obviously you never want to lean too heavily into those things because you don't want to be predictable. You don't want to, run the ball 90% of the time. You've Croft in there, and then vice versa. Turned in the passing game, but you lean into it a little bit. You lean a little bit more towards the run game with Croft in there, and a little bit more towards the passing game with Herndon in there. So I feel like that you'll see a pretty good platoon between those two guys.
I think it's a smart point you just made. I do think that is why Croft might get the edge. And look, if Chris Herndon wants to get in the field more, he's going to have to improve that run blocking, because I'm really not as concerned about him as a receiver, even though he had some lumps last year. He did make some pretty impressive catches as the season went on. But yeah, if he wants to be on the field, he has to improve as a run blocker so the Jets aren't as one-dimensional when he's on the field. And what gives me hope there is that he's been a solid pass blocker, so he's not completely inept. And the other thing is the last time Chris Herndon was in this sort of offense, obviously not completely the same, was his rookie year with Jeremy Bates, where they did run a lot of West Coast under center type of stuff. I think Herndon is the perfect post-Gase breakout candidate. Look, I tend to be optimistic about this team, and about half of, if not more of it, does not come true. So you always have to measure expectations and try to find the guys most likely not to produce, which would make sense why Chris Herndon wouldn't necessarily come through. But I still believe in him. I still think that there's potential there. Maybe not as a tight end one. Maybe. We don't know that yet. But I still think that at the very least, Chris Herndon can be a very solid tight end two in this league, if not a tight end one.
Another good point on Herndon with the run blocking. Yeah. I actually think we talked about the scheme, how it benefits a few of these linemen in terms of the run scheme. I think Herndon maybe in the run game could benefit from it, because the reason he's good as a pass blocker, not a run blocker, is because he has good technique and he knows what he's doing and he's willing. So that helps him in the passing game, where you don't really have to be forceful and create movement. You just got to be in the right position. And in the run game, he does carry that over. It's just he's not really like a people mover. He's not a forceful dominant blocker. And so when you're running a lot of inside zone, like the Jets were the past couple of years, or at least last year with Adam Gase, it's, that's where he could kind of struggle a little bit, because you want your guys to create some movement to make those plays happen. But in an outside zone scheme where it's a little bit more athleticism based and just more based on, hook around your defender, seal him to the backside, you don't necessarily need your tight ends to create a ton of movement. It's a little bit more positioning based. Then it could benefit him a little bit. And that's not to say movement doesn't matter even in this type of scheme. Of course it does. But I think it more so than the offense they were running, it is a little bit more predicated upon positioning and athleticism than it is on just creating forceful movement. So I think that should benefit him too. So we'll see if maybe even his run blocking could improve with the coaching change.
Another guy who had an impressive day yesterday was Brandon Eccles, who had a pick six on James Morgan, who we're about to talk about next. Spoiler alert. I think that, there's a very open competition between all these young rookies that have come in. And if anybody, the thing that's like, Robert Saleh said this, that they're like hell on wheels. And it's like between Brandon Echols, Michael Carter II, Jason Pinnock, Hamza Nasruddin, and Jamian Sherwood, you're just hoping one of them hits, honestly. I mean, obviously it'd be great if many of them could hit, but if the Jets can just hit on one of those guys, I think they're in pretty good shape. Maybe hopefully two, maybe a linebacker in a corner. And Echols was the guy out of the three corners that I think I was the least sure about. But the reports are that the Jets are pretty high on him. And I think he has definitely the ability to carve himself out a role. I mean, the Jets cornerback position is so weak. I originally viewed him as more of making a special teams impact. But Michael, I mean, do you see Echols competing more for that slot corner spot, or do you see him more as maybe the outside corner? Although he's not necessarily the big type of corner that Robert Saleh likes, but it seems like a lot of his experience has been on the outside.
Well, I'm glad to see this play because Echols has kind of been the odd man out of the cornerbacks they drafted. There's been hype for everyone else, whether it's Isaiah Dunn as an undrafted free agent, Pinnock with his length on the outside, and then Carter II in the slot competing with Guidry. Echols has kind of been outside the mix and hasn't had a lot of hype. So to see him make the pick six off of Morgan, generate some positive vibes for that is a good thing for him. Even though it was it appeared to be a pretty bad throw by James Morgan.
Yeah,
you
you
can't
don't have to be
really see
nice.
the whole thing.
You don't have to be nice. It was a bad throw.
But we know I won't be nice to guys if they don't deserve it. But it was good to see the energy, the positive energy for him because he's kind of not gotten much attention. But in terms of where he's going to play, that'll be really interesting. At least in this rep, it seemed like he was on the outside against Corey Davis. So it could be that he's sticking there, but that's really been the whole discussion with Echols throughout the offseason. It's like, is he outside? Is he inside? Because he played outside in college, but his frame, standing only 5'10, 180, lends him to playing in the slot. He also doesn't have much length either, only 12th percentile arms, 30 and a quarter inches. So that's a slot corner frame, but he's playing all outside at Kentucky. And, it definitely seems like Carter II and Guidry are the guys competing in there. So he is that sort of tweener defensive back, and maybe that serves him well. Maybe versatility is his calling card, the fact that he can do both. And his athletic numbers were really good in terms of his 40 time. He had a 436. His vertical jump, broad jump, three cone were all really good. So I feel like versatility could be the calling card for him. He doesn't. This will hold him back from being maybe a long-term starter because if you're going to start, you'd like to have a defined position, defined skills. But the fact that he can probably do multiple things because of his frame and experience could help him a lot as a backup. And then he could also be a good special teams player because of his athleticism. So it'll be interesting to see where he fits in because more so than anyone else, more than any of these draft picks, he's the biggest tweener of the defensive players they drafted. Everyone else, it kind of is easy to see where they'll fit in. But for him, there are a few different ways it could go.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I mean, hey, Darrell Revis is the Jets' most accomplished outside corner. He's also 5'11". I mean, he has 20 pounds on Echols. But I think the thing is that the stereotypical Robert Saleh outside corner is that big-bodied press bail zone corner. And Echols, we'll see how he fits. But I agree with you. I think he's probably more of a slot guy. But look, they're going to try to get their best corners on the field. So I think he's well in the mix in that slot battle between Michael Carter III or Michael Carter II and Javelin Guidry. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him get some outside reps as well. The last dud we'll talk about, and then we'll wrap it up here after a brief little debate. James Morgan, I mean, not much else to say. We kind of covered it a little bit. I will pose this question to you, and we talked about it a little beforehand. I mean, what is your realistic best case scenario for James Morgan? So not the scenario where he turns out that he's Tom Brady and the Jets can either start him or trade him for a boatload of picks after an amazing preseason. I mean, after what we've seen, it's probably not going to happen. But after kind of what we've seen from a season of, well, we got some training camp practices last year, no preseason games. We've had a mini camp and some training camp practices. This so far, we haven't seen him in a preseason game. But based off the player that he is, the type of strength that he has, How do you feel like he fits this offense? And then what do you kind of think is a realistic ceiling for James Morgan's career at this point? Because it seems like a lot of Jets fans are pretty down on him even after just 2 practices of him starting.
Yeah, we were talking about this before, and I think what we both settled on is that we just like to see him be a competent backup. And evaluating backup quarterbacks, you got to temper your expectations. There's a reason they're backup quarterbacks and not starting quarterbacks, so they're never going to be good, but there is still a spectrum for backup quarterbacks. You could have, like we talked about, Sean Mannion's and Josh Johnson's numbers. You could have guys go 1-7 or 0-3 and throw 0 touchdowns. You could have that, or you could have guys like Nick Foles, like Ryan Fitzpatrick, who've come in and been not terrible or passable, keeping your offense afloat, or like Joe Flacco last season, which you brought up. I think is a good bar for James Morgan to shoot for. Joe Flacco came in last season. I don't think anyone would say he was good, but the Jets were still able to play football and run the
He looked
offense
better
with
than
him,
Darnold.
and he will look better than the starting quarterback. So I think that's a good comparison, even in terms of play style. Which I'm not going to steal this one from you because you brought it up. That's why I'm mentioning it. So you can talk
No,
about
go
Flacco a
ahead.
little
Go
bit,
ahead.
but yeah, in terms of play style, Flacco is a pocket passer, bigger guy like James Morgan. But I think that is interesting in terms of scheme fit. He is kind of like Pirine. Seems like he's drafted more so for an Adam Gase offense than I think what they'll be running now. So it will be interesting to see how he fits into this. But I think that's what you're trying to shoot for. Just be an okay backup. We don't need you to be the next Dak Prescott or anything like that out of the fourth round, but just be competent. And
Right.
the pick six he threw in practice today isn't really on that track, but he is essentially a rookie. He's going to be playing his first
Right.
preseason games. Last season's offseason was drastically shortened, even without the preseason games. Just the practices outside of that, there was no rookie mini camp. So he's, even for a second year player, not that experienced. So
Right.
we'll see what happens. But I think that's all you want to see. Just be an okay backup.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the 2020 class come under some scrutiny, and I think the good thing about Joe Douglas is he definitely marries the front office to the coaching staff, and the benefit of that is that you're always working towards one goal, one vision. It seems like the big problem with the Jets the last decade or so is that they've had a lot of contradictory moves. They've had moves that just don't really make much sense and cohesiveness, and they didn't really guy didn't fit the scheme, or why would you draft this guy if you already have this guy on the roster? A good example is how they allocated assets to the defensive line, where it's like Quinn Williams. I'm very happy they just have him, and I wouldn't necessarily change that pick in retrospect, but it's like you have Leonard Williams. Before that, you had Sheldon Richardson. When you brought Leonard Williams in, you had Muhammad Wilkerson. You'd already drafted Quentin Cope. They kept addressing the defensive line because, okay, best player available, but it's like, okay, at a certain point, you have to move on. You have to try to build a team towards a vision. The thing I like about Joe Douglas is now with Robert Saleh, who is a coaching staff I believe in and the scheme I believe in, I really think you're going to start to get a brand of Jets football. And we haven't had that. The Jets have had no identity for the last decade. And when you think of a Buffalo Bill player, you know what a Buffalo Bill player looks like. When you think of a Pittsburgh Steeler player, you know what a Pittsburgh Steeler player looks like. They have an identity, and the Jets have not had that. When you have a coaching staff married to a front office, you get that. You have, okay, that's a Jet. I mean, that it goes back to Rex Ryan's mantra, play like a Jet. I mean, that is a Jets football player right there. When you marry the scheme in the front office. But the downside of that is that last year's draft, you see a few guys that on the surface maybe aren't completely ideal scheme fits, from Mims to James Morgan to Lamichael Pirine. They clearly drafted. Now, look, that doesn't completely apply because I think Mekhi Becton's a great scheme fit. I think Bryce Hall is a very good scheme fit. But I think you see some guys who are going to have to carve themselves out their own role. But look, even if the Jets just hit on Mekhi Becton and another player, let's just say Bryce Hall, even if they get starters out of Becton, good starters in Becton and Hall, still a solid draft class. Like, I think it's still a good draft class. And I think the other thing Michael and I were talking about, not to get too far off on a tangent, is when you judge a draft class or judge a GM, I think you have to judge the process more than the outcome. because you never really can predict how things are going to go, what's going to happen in a player's career, the injuries they're going to suffer, whatever. You just have to judge them based off the process they went through. Look, if you have a few years of a horrific outcome after horrific outcome, then maybe you can make a change, but you have to look at the process. And when it's like, okay, Kai Becton, great pick. Denzel Mims, even if it doesn't work out, which I do think it will, I'm not going to hate on it because he was a scheme fit. They traded down. He was tremendous value, huge need, and he's been talented. I think that checks the boxes. I love the Denzel Mims pick, even though he might not be a starting receiver for the Jets. Ashton Davis, I criticize a little bit, but it's like, okay, well, if he has a first-round grade on your board and you were uncertain about Marcus May's contract situation, you think he could be a May replacement, makes sense, etc. So that's kind of how I'm viewing that draft class. And with James Morgan, the thought process there was great fit in Adam Gase's offense. They thought that, look, the Patriots are definitely going to be interested in him. They felt that he could develop into a very good backup that you could then, if he performed well in the preseason, you could flip him for some picks. And if not, you have a good backup that is going to be good in the quarterback room because apparently he's a good film guy, good camaraderie guy, whatever. That's the process. I don't love that process, but I at least understand that decision. I think you can definitely criticize that pick because I don't think that was the best process for the team, especially where it was at. But when you look at the draft class as a whole, I still think I love the 2021 draft a lot more. But I think the 2020 class, there's a caveat there because it was definitely influenced heavily by Adam Gase and Greg Williams. Michael, before we get out of here, we have 5 training camp battles, and we're going to make our predictions for who will be the opening day starter. And by the end of training camp, we'll look at it and see how we did. I want to start with running back. Who do you think opening day week 1 is the Jets starting running back?
I'm going to go with Michael Carter.
Yeah, I second that as well. I think that even though it's going to be running back by committee, I think that this kid's certainly going to impress, and the Jets are not going to be afraid to start 4 rookies on offense, and hell, maybe even 2 on defense. Sticking with the offense, receiver number 2 on the outside. Talked a lot about Denzel Mims. Seems like Keelan Cole's been getting the reps there. How do you see the Jets outside number 2 receiver panning out as far as a starter week 1?
I think even though Elijah Moore will probably be, lining up the slot, motioning a lot, I think he is essentially going to be the wide receiver too. I think he'll play the second most snaps, and if not leading the team in targets, be in that conversation with Corey Davis. So I really, and he can play on the outside. He did it in college. So I think he is going to see a pretty healthy split where he's lining up, where he's just all over the place. So I really think Moore is going to essentially be that second wide receiver, and then the rotation will really come beyond that in the slot with Crowder and Cole, and then Denzel Mims also can rotate into the game, and Moore kicks into the slot. So I think Elijah Moore is really going to be the wide receiver too.
Yeah, we're just too agreeable because I agree with that. I think that Moore is going to be a very big part of this Jets offense. And I think that I think the Jets are definitely going to explore having him and Crowder on the field at the same time, using a lot of jet motions, getting the ball in their hands. I think Moore is definitely going to have an impact. And I think you're right. I think he will start on the outside. I think the question mark there is if you're going to have both him and Crowder on the field, if you want to do some of the things like wide receiver screens, how does the blocking come into effect here? Because we've talked about how it's a receiver heavy team. And if you're going to go with 11 personnel, but you still want to run some of those West Coast concepts where you can run the football, reasoning would say that you'd want your best run blocking receivers out there. And I think Crowder and Moore definitely aren't that. Davis certainly is. So that would be the only hiccup. I think in terms of targets, Moore is going to be second behind Davis, maybe even number 1. But if the Jets are going to focus on, if we're just going based off week 1 starting lineup, first down, 1st and 10 against the Carolina Panthers, it wouldn't surprise me if it was Keelan Cole. But right now, I'll stick with Elijah Moore. Weak linebacker. I think this one might be we might actually disagree with, because I'm going to say Hamza Nasruddin, the rookie, which is a bit of a hot take, not too bad. It's between Nasruddin, Sherwood, and Cashman. I think I know where you're going, but I think Nasruddin, out of the 3 of them, has the highest upside, and I think Robert Saleh is going to try to form him into a legit linebacker in this league. I think they see Sherwood maybe more as the eventual Mike linebacker, maybe even replacing Gerard Davis after a year or 2. He'll certainly get his reps there, but I think Nasruddin is handmade for that weak linebacker spot.
This might be a hot take, I feel like most people have kind of counted him out. I'm going to go with Blake Cashman. I think he's going to be the guy to take that third linebacker spot. You know, he's actually a pure linebacker. The other two have potential, but they're converting over from safety. They're day 3 picks. Nasruddin's coming off of an injury, which he did return from near the end of the season, but still's kind of recovering from that to an extent. Um, and Sherwood kind of has athleticism deficiencies that he's going to have to overcome. So I'm going to go with Blake Cashman. I consider myself a Blake Cashman guy. That doesn't mean I think he's good or he's going to be a great player, but I think there are some intriguing things he showed to work off of. As long as he can stay healthy, I think his experience is going to win him out against a couple of late round rookies who are transitioning positions. But it wouldn't surprise me if it were either Sherwood or Nasruddin at all, considering that they were picks by this regime. But I'm gonna go with Cashman. I know it's a little bit of a surprise pick, but I think he's going to be the third guy in that linebacker rotation.
Lastly, and I'm going to lump these two together because they're both corners. Who do you think is going to be the outside of Bryce Hall, which seems like a shoe in at this point, corner number 2, and then the nickel corner number 3?
Corner number 2, I'm going to go with. I'll just list my answers here, and then you could follow up.
All
I
right.
won't give descriptions. So I'll go cornerback 2. I'm going to go with Jason Pinnock. Nickel corner, I'll go with Javelin Guidry.
Well, we completely disagree on that because I'm going Bless Austin and Michael Carter II, which I think is probably the obvious answer because that's been who's starting so far. But I think Austin is the most veteran corner on this team, surprisingly enough. Or I guess we're not using veteran if we have to go back to that debate. But certainly has the most amount of snaps. And I think he actually is a fairly good fit in this offense. You look at what he did towards the end of 2019 when he got some of the same hype that Bryce Hall's been getting. I think a lot of the zone concept coming down, making stops against the run. The thing with both him and Hall and these Robert Saleh corners, you want big guys, but you want guys who are fearless and aren't afraid to get involved in the running game, especially if you're only going to rush 4. I think Austin, out of all those guys, is the best run defender, and I think that's what's going to win him. I also think he's a good zone corner. He's entering year 3. I think he ultimately wins that job. And I think Michael Carter II, hey, he's gotten some reviews. I almost put him in the studs list. He's gotten some good reviews so far out of training camp. So I think he was drafted with the intention of being the starter nickel corner. That's why the Jets didn't bring back Brian Poole. So I think he opens it up. I think it's going to be a tight race between Guidry, Eccles, and Carter II. I think he ultimately gets the nod, though.
I think the duo that you listed is probably most likely. I just want to be out there a little bit, although I do feel pretty good about Pinnock at corner 2, just because I'm not a huge fan of Bless Austin. I think Pinnock is a really tailor-made fit to this defense. More so than Austin, I think, because they're both tall, lengthy guys, but I feel like Austin's really hasn't shown much of anything as a press guy. He can do some decent stuff when he's playing off. Sometimes he does still miss a lot of tackles and bust not necessarily bust coverages, but his technique even in off coverage isn't great. But with Pinnock at Pittsburgh, he played a lot of press bail, pressing the line and then dropping back into cover 3 or whatever they were playing. So I feel like he's a little bit more of a natural scheme fit. And also there's, again, the regime advantage with him being drafted by this general manager and this coaching staff, whereas Austin was neither of those things. So I think you're probably right. Austin will get it because of the experience advantage, but I do kind of like Pinnock there. And then in the slot, I'm just a Javelin Guidry guy. I like what he did last season. I'm a Carter II guy too. So he has some great film and fantastic numbers at Duke, and he's been one of, if not the most impressive defensive back of the offseason so far. So I absolutely could see him doing it too. But I'm going the opposite with you. So with
All right.
the corner 2, I'm going with the rookie, and in the nickel, I'm going with the more experienced guy. Whereas you went the opposite, but your prediction isn't bad at all. It's probably the most likely one.
Right. I'm very confident in Michael Carter II. I'll extend a little olive branch here. I think that Bless Austin will be the starting outside corner week 1. I think Pinnock will be the starting outside corner alongside Bryce Hall week 18. So I think there's going to be a little
Yeah.
bit of a transition there. I just think it'll probably happen during the season for the rookie. But like you said, I think Pinnock has the higher ceiling, has the general manager behind him. I think he's ultimately going to take over for Austin, unless Austin's really impressing. But I doubt that'll be the case. But I think to open up the season, Austin will be the guy.
And we've seen that the last 2 seasons, and injuries played a part in it. But in 2019, Tremaine Johnson starts the season, Bless Austin finishes it. And then last
Wait,
year, Pierre Desir starts the season, and Bryce Hall finishes it. So,
right,
so we've already seen the last 2 years
right.
an example of veteran starts the season. And yes, Tremaine Johnson, he's a veteran. Pierre Desir is a veteran. Um, Veteran starts the season, then the rookie, late round rookie, finishes it later on. So I
Yeah,
feel like we could see that again.
definitely. I think Pinnock is the heir to Bryce Hall's throne. Hall is the big X factor in that group. I mean, if he can be anything, this defense is in good shape. If the entire cornerback position's a shit show, then I don't know how good the entire team is going to be. But if Hall is okay and they can get some solid production out of the rookies and the young guys, I think this defense can be very good. We're gonna get out of here. We'll be back on Monday. We do have a bit of an ad read to do here, but yeah, the Jets have practices today when this podcast comes out, Saturday, and then we'll have Monday. We'll be talking more Jets football, and we'll be back on our Monday, Thursday schedule. We promise. You can follow us at CYJ Pod on Twitter. You can follow Michael _Nandy and myself at Ben W. Blessington. Go to jetsxfactor.com for the best Jets content out there. Please rate, review, subscribe to us on iTunes. It helps podcasts out a ton. And then, yeah, if you would like to potentially win a sweepstakes to go to whatever Jets game of your choice this season, maybe the Jets-Panthers game. It's not Zach Wilson's uncle sweepstakes. It's brought to you by Canadips CBD, which is the nation's leading tobacco and nicotine-free dip alternative with CBD. And they're excited to present the game of the year, which is one winner chosen by August 31st. If you go to candidapescbd.com and click the link, or visit Candidate's main Instagram and look for the blue check mark, one winner will be chosen and can bring a +1 to any regular NFL season game, which includes airfare for 2 and luxury hotel lodging, including great seats for the game. Canada CBD is a fast-acting and innovative way to consume CBD that works and tastes great and won't make you play sneak-a-chew with the wife during football season. That's right. Canadips is randomly choosing one lucky winner for the fan experience of a lifetime. So head to CanadipsCBD.com and enter, or go to the official @Canadips Instagram and type it all the way out to find the blue check account. Michael, if you could go to any game this season, what would it be? Free of cost. I mean, if you could choose one game to go to, what would it be? London?
That's what came to mind first because it would be so unique. So I'm already going to the first 2 games. I have tickets to the Carolina game and the home opener against New England. So I'm very, very excited about those. Beyond that, though, I guess London comes to mind first, just because that would be such a unique experience. But other than that, the first one that came to mind was the Jacksonville game. I feel like Wilson versus Lawrence could be one that we look back on in a long time as the start of maybe a long time AFC rivalry. In terms of road games, are there any road games that stand out to you? I'm
Well,
trying to think.
the obvious one is the Panthers. I know you already talked about it,
Yeah.
and I was just thinking about it. That game could not be any bigger for the Jets. I just think that will define. I mean, maybe not define, but it'll really set the tone for the season. Because even if they win that game and then let's say they lose the next 3, I still think the vibe around. Let's say they win the game in a good fashion, not like an ugly 6-0 win. Like Zach Wilson plays well, the Jets shut down Sam Darnold, like a good win for the team. That just sets the vibe for the entire season.
It's
And
definitely an unusually high stakes game for an opener.
because it's like if you win that and they lose the next few games, it's like, all right, well, look, this is still a rebuilding team, but Robert Saleh, they got the right stuff. If the Jets go out there and lose to the quarterback they just traded away and controversially traded away in some people's minds, obviously not in Jets fans' minds, it just the vibe and all the energy, it's not going to be completely sucked away. I certainly think the Jets, as the season goes on and the team gets more mature, are going to improve, but it'll just set the whole same old Jets. Of course, you trade your quarterback and you lose to whatever. I just think that's such a big game. So if I could choose any game, that would be the game. Maybe I'll go to the game. I think I'm going to go to the Jets Pats game week 2. But yeah, even that game, like if the Jets beat the Panthers, imagine the crowd for the home opener against the Patriots. I just think that week one game is just so big. I mean, maybe the biggest week one game that the Jets have had in a long time. I honestly, I can't think of a bigger one in the last few years. So
Yeah, I agree. Maybe 2016 or 2019, although
maybe 2016, maybe, but even that, I mean, I think
it's just different. To get something like this where you're starting a new era by facing the old face of the era that you're moving on from is just such a unique circumstance that it probably has happened very few times,
right.
if ever, in the history of the league.
I would say the stakes are, maybe 2011 against the Cowboys on Sunday Night Football, 10-year anniversary 9/11. I think that's number one. But outside of that, I think this is the highest stakes opener they've had. I mean, which is exciting. I like that the Jets are actually in meaningful games, even if it's only for 1 week. Just been sick of playing Buffalo, and just, the last few openers haven't been as exciting. All right, well, we'll get out of here. Thank you so much for listening to us. Everybody have a great weekend. Go Jets. Let's hope for a few good Zach Wilson practices that'll hold us over until the official start of the preseason and then the regular season. So everybody, great weekend. Go Jets. Thanks for listening.